What if one of the world's greatest civilizations didn't simply vanish, but rather transformed in ways we're only now beginning to understand? The Maya built cities of astonishing complexity across the Yucatan Peninsula and beyond, monumental temples that scraped the jungle sky, intricate water systems that channeled life through limestone and stone, and a written language so sophisticated that it recorded not just events, but the movements of stars and the genealogies of kings stretching backward through centuries. Yet somewhere between the 9th and 10th centuries, something shifted. The great classical cities were abandoned, the stone monuments fell silent, the courts that had hummed with ceremony and power went dark. For centuries, this mystery captivated the Western imagination, a civilization that seemed to vanish entirely, leaving behind only ruins and questions. If you've ever found yourself drawn to the slow unraveling of ancient enigmas, to stories that blur the line between triumph and collapse while you drift towards sleep, consider subscribing to this series. We explore the deep mysteries of lost worlds with the kind of unhurried attention they deserve, and each episode is crafted to guide you gently into rest while revealing what scholars have pieced together from stone, soil, and silence. The truth, as it has emerged from decades of archaeological work, is far more nuanced and far more human than a simple disappearance. The Maya didn't vanish, they transformed. Some cities fell, while others endured. Some regions emptied, while others filled. And the reasons, they were woven from climate, politics, ritual, and choice in ways that speak to our own moment with an eerie, quiet clarity. To understand what happened, we must first understand what was. Picture the landscape as it was over 1,000 years ago. The Yucatan Peninsula, where much of classical Maya civilization flourished, was not the uniform jungle many imagine. It was a patchwork of territories, each supporting great urban centers that rose from the limestone bedrock like mountains of human intention. These were not isolated cities. They were nodes in a vast network, connected by sacred roads called Sakbiob, by trade routes that moved cacao and obsidian and jade, by diplomacy and war, by marriage alliances between royal families, and by a shared cosmology so deep and so intricate that it bound them together even as they competed for dominance. Consider the scale. At its height, around the year 750, the Maya civilization supported a population that some scholars estimate at over 10 million souls. In the southern lowlands alone, where the greatest classical cities stood, the density of settlement rivaled that of medieval Europe. Tikal, one of the preeminent centers, covered more than 100 square kilometers. Calakmul, its great rival to the north, dominated an equally vast territory. These cities were not just places to live, they were theaters of power and cosmos, where every pyramid was a mountain, every ritual a reenactment of the creation of the world itself. The ball courts where nobles played were not merely recreation, they were sacred stages where the hero twins of the Popol Vuh were symbolically reborn with each match. The stelae that rose in the plazas were stone books, carved with hieroglyphic narratives that announced the victories of kings and the movements of celestial bodies. The Maya had developed a form of writing that could capture both the sacred and the mundane. Royal genealogies and astronomical tables, the names of captured prisoners and the dates of ritual dedications. They understood the mathematics of 0 centuries before Europe did. They tracked Venus through its 8-year cycle with an accuracy that survives into our own calculations. They built aqueducts and reservoirs, terraced hillsides for agriculture, and created sophisticated systems of water management that allowed them to thrive in an environment where rainfall was abundant in some seasons and perilously scarce in others. The civilization was not static, it was not unchanging, it was dynamic, competitive, and deeply dependent on a complex web of ecological, political, and spiritual relationships. And then, Over a period spanning roughly 2 centuries, from around 800 to 1000 CE, this entire system began to unwind. Not everywhere at once, not in a single catastrophic moment, but rather in a cascade of collapses, a slow dimming of the great centers, a gradual emptying of the monumental cities that had seemed as permanent as the stone they were built from. The last dated monument in many classical cities appears in the late 8th or early 9th century. After that, the inscriptions stop. The ritual cycles that had marked time and ordered society seem to break. The cities that had supported hundreds of thousands stand empty, their temples slowly taken back by the very jungle they had emerged from. What caused this? That question has haunted scholars for nearly 2 centuries. In the 19th century, observers suggested that the Maya had simply given up, that some cultural flaw or spiritual exhaustion led them to abandon their civilization. Others proposed catastrophic invasion or disease. Some invoked the purely mystical, a civilization that had grown too proud, too distant from natural law, and was struck down by divine judgment. These explanations were speculative, sometimes colored by the prejudices of their era. They told us more about the anxieties of the observers than about what actually occurred. It is only in the past 50 years or so that a more complex and evidence-based picture has begun to emerge. The Maya didn't simply collapse because they wanted to, or because they failed. They collapsed because the systems that held them together, environmental, political, and spiritual, underwent simultaneous and cascading stresses that eventually overwhelmed their ability to adapt. Some of those stresses came from outside, some came from within, and some, perhaps most importantly, came from the relationship between the Maya and the land they depended upon, a relationship that, over centuries of civilization building, had grown increasingly precarious. This is the story we will explore together. It is a story that has no single villain and no single moment of truth. It is instead a slow-motion unfolding of choices, consequences, and the deep vulnerabilities that lie hidden within even the greatest human achievements. And as we move through it, we will find something unexpected. Not the ending of the Maya, but rather a transformation, a survival, and a series of lessons about power and resilience that echo across the centuries into our own time. Cities that rose like mountains from the jungle, temples whose astronomical alignments suggest minds calibrated to the turning of celestial bodies in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate. They were not primitive people, no matter how that word was once carelessly applied to them. They were architects of mathematics, interpreters of time itself, and in many ways, they were asking the same questions we still ask today about what it means to build something that lasts. The civilization we call Classic Maya, the period of their greatest architectural and artistic achievement, flourished for roughly 6 centuries, from around the year 250 to 900 of the Common Era. They constructed the most sophisticated urban centers of the pre-Columbian Americas. Tikal rose to perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. Copan, Palenque, Calakmul, these were not villages or outposts, but genuine cities with dense populations, complex hierarchies, and intricate systems of water management that kept pace with their growing numbers. And then, over a span of perhaps 100 years, something shifted. The cities fell silent, the monuments stopped being built, the calendars, which the Maya had kept with meticulous precision for generations, seemed suddenly to matter less than they once had. For centuries, this collapse was treated as a mystery akin to the disappearance of Atlantis, a civilization that vanished, disappeared, ceased to be. But that interpretation was, we now understand, profoundly incomplete. The Maya did not vanish. Millions of Maya people exist today, living across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They speak Mayan languages, descended from the language of their ancestors. They maintain traditions that reach backward through centuries. What happened, rather, was a transformation of their civilization from one form into another, a decentralization, a shift from the grand city-state model to something more dispersed, more adaptive, less visible to the archaeological eye. Understanding why that transformation occurred requires us to look at the forces that were quietly building beneath the surface of Maya civilization for generations before the collapse began. The cities did not fail suddenly, as lightning fells a tree. They weakened, slowly, under pressure from multiple directions at once. And that is perhaps the more human story, the way that cascading problems, none of them necessarily fatal on their own, can combine to reshape an entire world. Consider the matter of water first, because water is life, particularly in a place like the Yucatan Peninsula, where the landscape offers few rivers and much of the rainfall that arrives in the season comes in torrential bursts before disappearing beneath the earth into hidden aquifers. The Maya, brilliant engineers that they were, responded by building reservoirs, constructing sophisticated networks of channels and ditches to direct water where they needed it, storing abundance against scarcity. In the north, in what is now Belize, they built intricate systems that fed their cities through the dry season. At Tikal, in the rainforest lowlands, they maintained a complex series of reservoirs and canals that allowed their massive population to survive in an environment that at first glance seems nearly impossible to settle. The sheer ingenuity required to sustain a city of 100,000 people in the middle of dense jungle cannot be overstated. But population density, while it demonstrates cultural achievement, also creates vulnerability. When you concentrate that many people in one place, you create dependency. The system works beautifully as long as the conditions it was built to manage remain stable. And that is where the story grows more complicated, more troubling, and perhaps more familiar to modern ears. Between roughly 800 and 1000 CE, the Maya heartland experienced a series of droughts. These were not brief dry spells, easily weathered by a sophisticated society with reserves. They were extended periods of reduced rainfall, lasting years, sometimes stretching across decades. The evidence for this comes from several sources, from tree rings that show narrow growth during dry years, from lake sediments that reveal periods when water levels dropped significantly, from stalagmites in caves that record the chemical signature of reduced precipitation. When we examine this evidence closely, a pattern emerges that is at once subtle and devastating. The droughts came in pulses. There would be years of relatively normal rainfall, which allowed the reservoirs to refill, the crops to grow, hope to seem justified. And then another dry period would arrive, drawing down the stored water again, stretching the reserves thinner. This on-again, off-again pattern. This was particularly cruel to a system built on the assumption of eventual abundance, because it kept the stored reserves from ever fully recovering. What had been a triumph of engineering, the ability to concentrate large populations through water management, became a vulnerability. A smaller, dispersed population could have migrated during drought, sought resources elsewhere, adapted through movement. But the Maya cities were not mobile. They were rooted. Their legitimacy, their power, their very existence was bound up in the land they occupied, the temples they had built, the ancestors they had buried there. You could not simply walk away from Tikal the way you might abandon a hunting camp. To abandon the city was to abandon everything your lineage had built, everything that gave you status and meaning. So what happened instead? People endured. They drew on their reserves. They performed the rituals they believed would bring rain, appealing to their gods and their ancestors to intercede on behalf of the living. And when the rains did not come, when the desperation deepened, something darker emerged, something that the archaeological record is only now beginning to reveal to us through careful study of skeletal remains and isotopic analysis of ancient diet. The evidence suggests that during the later phases of these droughts, populations began to fragment. Hierarchies grew more rigid and more desperate. Violence increased. The bonds that had held these complex societies together through generation after generation began to fray under the stress of scarcity. Consider what this might have felt like for an ordinary person living in a Maya city in the year 880 CE. You would have been aware of the drought, surely. Perhaps the reservoirs were visibly lower than they should have been. The rationing of grain would have been evident, the tightening of belts quite literal. Your king would have been performing increasingly elaborate ceremonies, invoking powers that seemed less responsive with each passing year. Your faith in the system might have deepened or begun to crack. If your children were hungry, if your neighbors were speaking in whispers about the failure of the rulers to prevent this catastrophe, if you wondered whether the old ways were truly sufficient to see you through, how much longer would you have remained in the city? How much longer would you have accepted the authority of leaders whose power seemed to depend on their ability to intercede with forces they could no longer influence? Ways we are only now beginning to comprehend. The Maya understood mathematics in a way that seemed almost prescient. They conceived of the number zero centuries before such a concept appeared in Europe. They mapped the movements of Venus with an accuracy that would not be matched again until the advent of telescopes. And yet, having built this architecture of knowledge, having raised cities that gleamed with white limestone and painted stucco, they walked away. The question of why has haunted archaeologists for generations, each decade arriving with new theories, new evidence, new interpretations of the silent stones. What we now understand, pieced together from pollen cores and sediment layers, from the analysis of tree rings and ceramic fragments, is that collapse was not a sudden rupture, but rather a long, grinding dissolution. The Maya civilization did not vanish in a cataclysm. It unraveled, thread by thread, across generations. Consider the 13th century. By then, the great cities of the southern lowlands, the heartland of classic Maya culture, were already in profound decline. Tikal, which at its zenith may have housed up to 100,000 souls, was being reclaimed by the forest. The temples no longer received the pilgrim processions. The stelae were no longer raised in the grand courtyards to mark the passage of time. Instead, the energy of Maya civilization began a slow migration northward, toward the Yucatan Peninsula, where for a time, new cities would flourish. Chichen Itza rose to prominence. Mayapan became a great capital, but even these urban centers would eventually fall silent. What precipitated this withdrawal? The evidence points toward a convergence of forces so powerful that when viewed together, they seem almost insurmountable. The first of these was environmental stress, particularly drought. For centuries, the Maya had thrived in an environment that appeared lush and abundant to the untrained eye, but in truth operated within narrow margins. The tropical forest is not the perpetual garden that early explorers imagined. It is a system in careful balance, and that balance can be disrupted by changes so subtle that they appear almost invisible in real time. Paleoclimatologists studying the sediments of ancient lakes have reconstructed rainfall patterns across the Maya region, and what emerges is a picture of increasing aridity beginning around the 9th century. The droughts were not uniformly distributed. Some regions experienced more severe desiccation than others, but the collective effect across the Maya world was significant. In a society that depended upon maize agriculture, upon the predictability of the seasonal rains, such climatic shifts posed an existential threat. And yet, we must ask ourselves, had not the Maya weathered droughts before? The archaeological record suggests earlier periods of environmental stress that the civilization had overcome. So what was different this time? The answer lies partly in numbers. By the terminal classic period, the 8th and 9th centuries, the population of the Maya lowlands had reached an unprecedented level. Recent estimates suggest a density of perhaps 200 to 300 people per square kilometer in some regions. This represented a civilization pushing against the absolute limits of what the land could support, with little margin for error, little flexibility should conditions change. The relationship between population and environmental capacity is one that has occupied human societies throughout history, though we rarely acknowledge it. The Maya faced the same calculus that would come to trouble other civilizations. As numbers grew, the buffer between survival and catastrophe shrank. When times were good, growth could seem endless. But when the rains failed, when harvests diminished year after year, the surplus that had sustained the cities, the monuments, the priesthood itself, began to evaporate like morning mist. And here we encounter something poignant in the archaeological record. There is evidence that the Maya people recognized something was amiss. Desperation begins to show itself in the monuments. Stela inscriptions become fewer and fewer, and those that were raised contain messages less celebratory in tone. In some cases, archaeological excavation has revealed that the noble and priestly classes began to engage in practices that suggest a heightened anxiety about cosmic balance. Increasingly elaborate bloodletting ceremonies, ritual performances that may have been intended to call the rain gods back to the sky. One can almost sense, in the careful reading of these remains, a civilization convinced that it had somehow fallen out of favor with the divine forces that sustained the world. This spiritual dimension of collapse deserves consideration, not as literal historical fact, but as a window into how the Maya themselves understood their circumstances. They possessed a cosmology that was deeply integrated with their observation of natural cycles, the movements of the planets, the patterns of the seasons, the regular return of the winter solstice. All of these were woven into a theology that explained the nature of existence itself. When the expected order of things began to fail, when the rains did not come as the sacred calendars predicted, the interpretation was not merely meteorological, but metaphysical. Consider what this must have meant for the priesthood. These were not charlatans or deceivers in any crude sense. They were the keepers of knowledge, the interpreters of the cosmos, the ones responsible for maintaining the proper relationship between the human and divine realms. If the rains failed, despite their ceremonies and calculations, if the crops withered despite their appeals to the gods, then something had gone profoundly wrong. Perhaps they had made an error in their readings of the heavens. Perhaps the gods themselves had grown angry or distant. The psychological weight of such a realization would have been immense, the loss of authority palpable. The erosion of priestly power and legitimacy appears to have been one of the critical developments in Maya collapse. A civilization's stability often rests not merely on its ability to provide material prosperity, but on its success in maintaining a coherent worldview, a sense that the order of things is as it should be. When that worldview begins to fracture, when the explanations that have always sufficed no longer seem adequate, a fundamental legitimacy crisis can unfold. We see hints of this in the archaeological record of the late Classic period, evidence of internal conflict, of violence within cities, of a breakdown of the elaborate social order that the Maya had constructed. Around this same time, in the 9th and 10th centuries, another factor entered the equation: political fragmentation. The cities of the Maya lowlands had never been unified under a single ruler in the way that, say, Egypt or Rome had been. Instead, the Maya world operated as a constellation of competing city-states, each with its own dynastic line, its own territorial claims, its own ambitions. This system had worked reasonably well during periods of climatic stability and population growth. But when resources became scarce, when harvests failed, and trade networks began to strain, the inherent tensions of this fragmented political system became difficult to manage. Warfare, always present in Maya society, intensified. Regional powers attempted to consolidate control, to secure access to remaining resources, to rebuild prestige through military conquest. The walls of some cities were reinforced, Defensive positions were established, and yet, as historical precedent might suggest, warfare itself consumed resources and disrupted the very agricultural systems that civilization depended upon. Soldiers had to be fed. Disputes over land and water rights inflamed conflicts. The social fabric began to tear, not in one catastrophic moment, but across decades and generations. What had been a relatively stable system of competitive coexistence among city-states deteriorated into something more volatile and destructive. And beneath all of these observable factors, the drought, the population pressure, the spiritual crisis, the political breakdown, there was perhaps a psychological dimension that is harder to measure but no less real. When a civilization has invested centuries in building a particular understanding of the world, in constructing monuments that assert permanence and power, there is a certain inevitability to the despair that comes when that civilization begins to crack. The very grandeur of the temples, which had served as a source of collective pride and cohesion, became a reminder of what was being lost. The cities that had been centers of learning and trade became places increasingly difficult to sustain. And so, slowly, the decision was made, perhaps not consciously or all at once, but across many individual choices, to leave. The abandonment of the great lowland cities appears not as a panicked flight, but as a measured, intentional withdrawal. Archaeological evidence suggests that the process unfolded over generations. Some people remained longer than others. Some sites were occupied in a reduced capacity for decades after their greatest period of influence had passed. But the inexorable direction was clear. The cities were being emptied, returned to the forest that had been held back for so long by labor and will. And perhaps this is where the true complexity reveals itself. For the collapse was not a sudden rupture, not a cataclysm that descended in a single season or year, but rather a slow unraveling that played out across generations, each one watching the world they inherited grow thinner, more fragile, more difficult to sustain. The great cities did not burn all at once, they emptied, and the difference between those two things, between catastrophe and attrition, shapes how we understand what it meant to be Maya when the great tradition began, imperceptibly, to fade. By the 9th century, the central lowlands were entering what scholars call the terminal classic period, a phrase that carries within it a kind of gentle resignation. The monumental inscriptions that had proclaimed the victories and cosmic significance of each king began to cease. Fewer stones were raised. Fewer dates were recorded. It is as though the urgency itself was draining away, as though the very impulse to leave a mark upon stone was losing its power. And we might ask ourselves what causes such a thing. When a civilization stops speaking to the future, what silence precedes that choice? The archaeological evidence suggests not one catastrophe, but several, layering upon one another like sediment in a riverbed. There was drought, a profound, recurring drought that lasted decades, perhaps even longer. The paleoclimatologists, studying ancient lakebeds and stalagmites, have detected a pattern in the water records. Drier conditions began around 800 CE and intensified through the 9th century. The timing aligns with the collapse of several major cities, and this is not coincidence, it is consequence. But here is where the story becomes more intricate still. The Maya did not perish from drought as a simple, helpless victim. They had endured droughts before. Their ancestors had navigated climate shifts across centuries. What appears to have happened instead is that the drought came at a moment when the civilization was already strained, when the population had grown to such densities that the landscape could no longer easily absorb a shock. The sophisticated system of water management that had allowed the Maya to thrive in regions that appear almost impossible to support large cities required constant maintenance, constant reinvestment. And when central authority began to fragment, when the great kings could no longer command the labor and resources to maintain these systems, the efficiency collapsed. The reservoirs silted, the canals fell into disrepair, the elaborate networks of agriculture that had fed hundreds of thousands simply failed. Picture, if you will, the moment when a farmer realizes that the rains will not come. He watches the sky, he makes offerings, he consults the astronomical tables. His family's survival has always been bound to these cycles, to the intimate knowledge of when to plant, when to wait, when to harvest. But the cycles have become erratic. The timing that was once reliable has become almost random. And then imagine that this farmer has debts to his noble patron, taxes to pay, corvée labor to provide. The burden, which was sustainable in times of plenty, becomes impossible in times of scarcity. What does he do? What do thousands do? Perhaps some migrated northward, toward the Yucatan Peninsula, where we know that Maya cities like Mayapan continued to flourish well into later periods. Perhaps some dispersed into smaller communities, adopting a less intensive form of agriculture that required less maintenance, less coordination, less faith in the permanence of kings. Perhaps some simply endured, generation after generation, as the grandeur faded around them. The archaeological record cannot yet tell us precisely, but we can see the results. By the early 10th century, the great classic Maya cities of the central lowlands had been largely abandoned, not destroyed, abandoned. The difference is crucial. It speaks to choice, to adaptation, to survival through dispersal rather than collapse. This raises a question that has long haunted scholars. How many of the people actually left, and how many remained? For centuries, the assumption was that the Maya civilization had simply ended, that the people themselves had vanished into history. But that was a kind of colonial fiction. The Maya did not vanish. They transformed, they dispersed, they adapted, and in pockets throughout the Yucatan, in the highlands of Guatemala, in communities that have survived to the present day, the Maya persisted, continuing to speak their languages, to maintain their sacred calendar, to practice forms of ritual and art that connect directly back to the classic period. They were not the magnificent kings in their limestone palaces, but they were Maya, and they endured. Consider what it must have felt like to watch your city, once the center of the world, slowly empty. The great pyramids, built across generations, would have stood silent. The ball courts where ceremonies and games had drawn crowds would have become overgrown. The palaces where scribes had recorded the movement of planets and the deeds of kings would have filled with insects and vines. Was this experienced as tragedy or as release? Did some see it as divine punishment? Did others view it as an opportunity to live differently, more simply, less bound to the constant demands of maintaining empire? The inscriptions that survive from this period are fragmentary, but they hint at deeper troubles. There are references to extended periods without rain. There are religious rituals performed with apparent desperation. There is a tone in what remains that suggests not confidence but uncertainty, not triumph but struggle. And then, by the middle of the 9th century, the monumental tradition simply ceased. The stones stopped being carved. The great projects stopped being undertaken. It was as though the civilization had decided that it could no longer afford the language of grandeur. But this was not the end of Maya culture. It was a transformation so profound that for centuries, outside observers failed to recognize what had actually happened. They saw only the absence of the monumental, the collapse of the urban, and they called it death. What they did not understand was that the Maya were adapting their entire way of being, reshaping their civilization to fit a new environmental and social reality. The gods remained, the calendar remained, the sacred mathematics remained. What was lost was the form, not the essence. And perhaps that distinction between the loss of a particular way of organizing power and the survival of the people themselves is the most important lesson the classic Maya collapse has to teach us. The highlands of Guatemala, meanwhile, tell a different story. Here, the major cities never achieved the same scale or density as those in the lowlands, and their decline followed a different trajectory. The political systems fragmented further, organizing themselves into smaller, more localized kingdoms. There was warfare, certainly. The inscriptions and the archaeological record both suggest increasing conflict between communities. But there was also continuity. The highland Maya culture, less dependent on the elaborate water management systems of the lowlands, proved more resilient. Some highland cities continued to thrive well into the post-classic period, and highland Maya culture remains vibrant even today. And so the collapse, which seems nearly total when viewed from the lowlands, appears more like a gradual reorganization when examined from the mountains. What becomes clear, as we sit with this history, is that the fall of the classic Maya was neither simple nor single. It was not famine or disease or invasion or civil war or drought alone, though each of these played some part. It was the intersection of many pressures, the way that a system that had achieved remarkable heights of complexity became vulnerable precisely because of that complexity. When everything is connected, when the entire system depends on the smooth functioning of each component, the water systems, the food supply, the religious calendar, the political hierarchy, the elite's ability to command resources, then the failure of one element can cascade through all the others. And the Maya civilization, for all its genius, was built upon a landscape that could become hostile, a climate that could shift, a population that could grow too large. None of these things, taken alone, would have meant the end. But together, over decades and generations, they meant transformation on a scale that altered the course of history. The cities did not empty in a single season. They drained like water through cracked pottery, slowly at first, then with accelerating momentum. Archaeologists studying settlement patterns have found that the decline followed a particular rhythm across the lowlands. Some cities were abandoned entirely within 2 or 3 generations, while others clung to existence for decades longer, their populations shrinking incrementally as families made the quiet decision to leave, to try their fortunes elsewhere, to seek lands that had not yet begun their slow forgetting. And in those final centuries of the classic period collapse, something curious happened in the written record. The stelae, those great stone monuments on which the Maya carved their history, their dates, their kings' accomplishments, they stopped appearing with the regularity that had defined the civilization for centuries. It is as though the very impulse to record, to commemorate, to speak to the future through stone, began to fade. There is a poignant silence in that absence. The last dated monument in the southern lowlands comes from the year 909 in our reckoning. After that, the ceremonial voice of the classic Maya kings falls silent. It does not shout. It does not end with apocalyptic fanfare. It simply stops. Now, one might imagine that the people themselves vanished entirely, swallowed by jungle and time. Yet this assumption, while understandable, contains a profound misunderstanding of what actually transpired. The Maya did not disappear. This is a crucial distinction, and one that has slowly transformed our understanding of the collapse as a whole. What ended was not the Maya civilization itself, but rather a particular expression of it, the classic period structure of divine kingship, the great ceremonial centers, the elaborate court systems that had coordinated the building of pyramids and the performance of ritual on a regional scale. The people remained. They migrated, yes. They reorganized themselves. They moved northward into the Yucatan Peninsula, where a new chapter of Maya civilization would unfold across the subsequent centuries. Some of them stayed behind, maintaining smaller settlements, living lives that were still unmistakably Maya in culture, language, and spiritual practice, but without the monumental architecture, without the inscribed royal records. They became what we might call the early post-classic Maya. Though the term itself contains an unavoidable bias, it defines them by what they were no longer, rather than by what they were becoming. Consider the human perspective for a moment. Imagine you are a scribe in the city of Tikal, in the year 820. Your family has served the court for generations. You write the glyphic records, you understand the calendar, you know the stories of your ancestors inscribed on stone. You watch as the reigns become unreliable. You see the nobles arguing about authority, about who speaks for the gods. You notice that fewer people are coming to the great ceremonies. The usual rhythm of tribute and trade disrupts. Food becomes less abundant. What would you do? Some scholars suggest that certain scribal families, sensing the fragmentation of the kingdom, deliberately moved their knowledge northward. Others may have continued their work in smaller towns, adapting their practices to a world with fewer patrons and fewer resources for grand monuments. The knowledge did not vanish, it transformed. It became something different, better suited to new circumstances, new landscapes, new forms of organization. The environmental evidence paints a picture of a civilization increasingly misaligned with its ecology. Pollen cores taken from lake beds reveal that the rainforest, which the Maya had painstakingly maintained and cultivated, began to recover from around the 10th century onward. This might seem paradoxical. Shouldn't human absence be good for the forest? Yes, and it was. But the fact that it recovered so rapidly suggests how intensively the Maya had managed that landscape and how thoroughly they had transformed it. The forest that grew back was not virgin wilderness. It was a forest reclaiming spaces that humans had deliberately shaped. There is something almost mournful in that image, the land returning to its own logic after centuries of human intention. Some of the surviving Maya settled in areas that had never been major centers of the classic period. They established new kingdoms in the northern lowlands, particularly around the city of Chichen Itza and later Mayapan. These post-classic Maya kingdoms operated according to different principles. They were less rigidly theocratic, they allowed for more merchant power, they developed confederacies and shared rule rather than the absolute authority of the divine king. Were these forms of government superior to the classic system? That is not a question with a clear answer. They were different adaptations to different circumstances. They persisted for another 5 centuries before Spanish conquest would impose yet another transformation on Maya society. What we can observe with some certainty is that the collapse of the classic Maya cities represents not an extinction but a decentralization, not a failure of Maya civilization, but a failure of a particular, perhaps over-elaborate, expression of it. The very vulnerability that led to the system's collapse, its dependence on continuous monumental building, its rigid hierarchies, its investment in sacred kingship as the ultimate legitimizing force. These weaknesses may have been inherent to the system's structure. A civilization built on the premise that the king's ritual performance maintains the cosmos is, by definition, fragile if that king's authority becomes questioned or if external conditions make the performance of traditional ritual impossible. And perhaps this is the deepest mystery of all. The Maya civilization did not collapse because they lacked intelligence or innovation. It did not collapse because they were inherently less capable than other societies. It collapsed because they built something magnificent, but something whose magnificence was also its vulnerability. The very features that allowed Tikal and Calakmul to dominate the lowlands for nearly 1,000 years, the concentration of power, the elaborate ceremonial machinery, the enormous investment in monument building, these features made the entire system precarious when the environmental conditions began to shift. One might wonder whether the Maya themselves understood what was happening as it unfolded. Did the court at Tikal in the year 830 recognize that they were witnessing the end of an era? Or did they experience it, as humans typically do, as a series of individual crises and adjustments, each one seemingly manageable at the time, until the cumulative weight of changes had fundamentally altered the world they inhabited? We cannot truly know. We can only imagine the consciousness of people caught in historical transformation, trying to maintain traditions that no longer seem to work. trying to explain cosmic disruptions through frameworks that had been adequate for centuries but now seemed insufficient. The jungle, meanwhile, waited patiently for its opportunity to reclaim what had been briefly cleared. The cities did not empty in a single season. Instead, what archaeologists have traced through decades of careful excavation is something far more gradual, far more human, a slow leakage of people from the great urban centers, families departing in clusters, entire neighborhoods falling silent not all at once, but stone by stone, season by season, year by year. The process might be imagined as a vast room slowly filling with shadows rather than plunging into darkness. By the 9th and 10th centuries, in what scholars call the Terminal Classic period, the machinery of civilization was grinding with increasing friction. The great stelae, those towering carved stones that commemorated royal achievements and cosmic cycles, stopped being erected. No fresh dates were carved into stone. The ball courts, those ceremonial spaces where ritual games had echoed with the sounds of nobility and the watching crowds, fell into disuse. Vines crept across their walls. The reservoirs, those intricate systems of channels and basins that had required constant maintenance and careful management, began to fail. Without the coordinated labor forces that royalty could command, without the ritualists who understood the precise timing of maintenance, the infrastructure that had sustained such densely populated regions simply could not hold together. It was not a matter of one year's drought destroying everything, but rather of consecutive failures in a system that had become increasingly brittle. What researchers have discovered through the study of sediment cores, those long cylinders of earth extracted from lake and swamp beds, tells a fascinating story of environmental stress compounding over generations. The evidence suggests that between roughly 800 and 1000 CE, the Maya heartland experienced not one catastrophic drought, but rather a series of them, punctuated by periods of near-normal rainfall that perhaps gave hope of recovery, only to be followed by renewed desiccation. Each drought depleted reservoirs further. Each failed harvest meant fewer seeds for the next planting. Each year of reduced agricultural output made it harder for the ruling class to provision the elaborate ceremonies that validated their authority and promised cosmic stability. And as the rituals faltered, as the rain still did not come, as the people's faith in the divine right of their kings to maintain the world's harmony began to crack, the very legitimacy of the entire system came into question. The temples where rulers had once channeled the gods' power into abundance now stood silent and empty. What would it have felt like, one might wonder, to have walked through a city where your grandparents had attended festivals and ceremonies, where the pyramids had been freshly painted and gleaming, and to find it increasingly abandoned, houses with their roofs caved in, plazas where no one gathered anymore? The psychological weight of such transitions cannot be easily measured, yet it must have been profound. When cities that had seemed eternal began to empty, when the prophecies of priests failed to materialize, when the elaborate cosmological order that had shaped every aspect of daily life suddenly seemed hollow, people responded as humans have always responded to such moments, with migration, with reordering of allegiances, with the search for places where the divine still seemed to work, where the rain still fell, where the harvest still came. Not all Maya civilization collapsed, and this is an important nuance that must be emphasized. While the great cities of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Copan, Calakmul, Karakol, experienced varying degrees of decline and abandonment, other Maya centers persisted, transformed, or even flourished during this period. In the northern Yucatan Peninsula, cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan continued to thrive for centuries after the Terminal Classic period. The Maya did not vanish. Rather, their civilization underwent a profound reorganization. The elaborate city-state system with its intricate networks of tribute and alliance fragmented into smaller, more localized political units. The emphasis on large-scale monumental construction and the kind of astronomical recording that had characterized classic Maya civilization gave way to different patterns of settlement and organization. Perhaps 40% of the Maya population remained in the region, but they lived in smaller communities, maintained different kinds of ritual practices, and developed new forms of political and economic organization. This transformation raises a series of questions about what we really mean when we speak of civilizational collapse. Is it the abandonment of cities, the cessation of particular kinds of cultural practices, the loss of certain technologies, the fragmenting of political units? The answer, most scholars now recognize, is that collapse is never monolithic. It is a process that affects different regions at different times, that different people experience in different ways, and that can coexist with continuity in other domains. Some of the people who left the great cities of the southern lowlands likely migrated northward, carrying with them their knowledge, their languages, their traditions. Archaeological evidence from the northern Maya regions shows certain stylistic changes in the post-classic period that seem to reflect influences from the declining southern centers, suggesting not merely a vanishing, but a displacement and reconstitution of populations. The final decades of major Maya cities like Tikal are extraordinarily poignant when examined carefully. The last dated monument at Tikal, a stela with an inscription recording historical events and cosmic connections, was erected in the year 909 CE. After this date, no new monuments were built. After this date, the great turning of the calendar that had been recorded and celebrated for centuries was no longer marked in stone. It is as if a conversation that had been sustained for more than 600 years simply ceased. The last evidence of habitation in the residential areas surrounding the temple complexes suggests that settlement continued for some time after monument construction stopped, but on an ever-diminishing scale. By roughly 950 CE, Tikal had been essentially abandoned by all but perhaps a handful of caretakers or survivors. The archaeological record shows us that the Peten forest, which had been cleared and cultivated and carefully managed to sustain hundreds of thousands of people, began to regenerate. The rainforest, given even a modest respite from human management, is remarkably resilient. Seeds from surrounding forest crept back into the abandoned agricultural lands. Trees began to grow through the courtyards of temples. Vegetation covered the pyramids. Within a century or two, without constant human intervention, the landscape began to revert to something approximating its pre-classic state. The great cities, which had seemed so permanent, so monumentally solid, slowly sank back into the green. Explorers and researchers centuries later would have to hack through dense jungle growth just to glimpse the carved stones beneath. The landscape had reclaimed what humans had reshaped, and the memory of these cities faded from the world's knowledge, preserved only in the silent testimony of stone beneath vine and root. The abandonment of these great cities unfolded more like a slow forgetting than a sudden flight. Generations passed as the people who remained in the lowlands watched the ceremonial centers lose their vitality. What had once been the beating heart of society, the pyramid, the plaza, the calendar stone, became places visited less and less frequently. The temples still stood, the ball courts remained, but the crowds that had gathered there for centuries grew thinner with each passing year. Consider what this meant for a people whose entire spiritual and administrative reality had been constructed around these monumental spaces. The priest who had performed rituals in the same temple his grandfather had consecrated would have noticed the changing patterns. Fewer pilgrims arrived for the seasonal festivals. The tributary payments became irregular. The scribes who recorded the movements of Venus and the cycles of the long count found themselves with fewer students to train. Knowledge that had been maintained in an unbroken chain for over 1,000 years began to fray at its edges. In some places, the transition happened across 2 or 3 generations. In others, it stretched across centuries. The Maya did not vanish. This is crucial to understand. They did not simply cease to exist. Rather, the specific civilization that had built Tikal and Calakmul and Palenque, the interconnected system of city-states that had shared writing and mathematics and astronomical knowledge, that particular arrangement of society began to dissolve. The people remained, they adapted, they moved, they transformed, and yet the physical evidence suggests something worth pondering. Why did they not rebuild? When the rains failed and the crops withered, why did the surviving populations not attempt to reconstruct what had been lost? There are moments in human history when civilizations collapse, and their successors immediately work to restore the old systems. The Romans did this repeatedly. The Chinese dynasties cycled through collapse and renewal. But the lowland Maya did not return to build new pyramids. Why? One possibility historians have explored involves the very foundation of Maya religious belief itself. The calendar system that had regulated their lives for so long, the intricate interlocking cycles that marked time and prophecy, had reached the end of a great cycle. Around the year 900, the 13th Baktun of the long count was completing. This was not the end of time itself, though some populations certainly experienced apocalyptic anxiety, but it was a moment of profound cosmic significance. The gods had ended a world age before. They would do so again. Was this cycle's end a sign that the old order had indeed reached its destined terminus? The Maya who lived through these decades may have interpreted their circumstances not as a failure of the system, but as a confirmation of it. The prophecy was unfolding as it should. The gods were working according to cosmic law. This interpretation would not have driven them to despair necessarily, but rather to acceptance. The calendar had always taught them that change was inevitable, that destruction preceded renewal, that worlds ended so that new worlds could begin. In the northern regions of the peninsula, a different story was beginning to unfold. Chichen Itza, a city that had been inhabited for centuries but had never achieved the dominant status of the great classical centers, began to grow in power and influence precisely as the southern cities were declining. Some scholars believe that populations displaced by the collapse in the south migrated northward, bringing their knowledge and their labor. Others suggest that northern cities, less dependent on the complex agricultural systems of the lowlands, were more resilient to environmental stress. Whatever the cause, Chichen Itza flourished where Tikal faded. The architectural style at Chichen Itza reveals something intriguing about this transition. The buildings constructed during its period of greatest power show a blending of Maya and Central Mexican influences. The Toltec people from the highlands had begun to expand their sphere of influence, and their cultural and military traditions mixed with Maya traditions in ways that had never occurred before. The serpent imagery of the Toltec gods merged with Maya iconography. The architectural styles of the central Mexican heartland influenced the way pyramids were designed and decorated. Was this blending a creative synthesis, or was it a sign that the purely Maya world was being absorbed into something larger? The question itself is complicated by what it means to be Maya. The Maya people were never politically unified. They were connected by shared language roots, shared religious beliefs, shared artistic and mathematical traditions, but they remained fiercely independent, organized into competing city-states, speaking dialects and languages that diverged from one another. When we speak of the collapse of Maya civilization, we are really speaking of the collapse of a particular form of organization, the intensive, hierarchical, calendar-bound society of the lowland city-states. The Maya people themselves continued, adapting and evolving. In the highlands to the south, in the regions that are now Guatemala and Honduras, other Maya cities persisted longer. Copan, which had been one of the greatest centers of the classical period, experienced its collapse around 800, earlier than many other major centers. But smaller highland cities continued to thrive. They developed their own political systems. They formed their own alliances. The cultural tradition remained recognizable as Maya, but it was no longer shaped by the vast hydraulic systems and the enormous ceremonial centers that had characterized the lowlands. What becomes apparent when one examines these different trajectories across the peninsula is that the collapse was not uniform. It was not a single event, but rather a cascade of failures and adaptations. Different populations responded to similar pressures in different ways. Some moved, some adjusted their agricultural practices, some reorganized their political hierarchies, some gradually abandoned their cities not because they could not survive there, but because the social and spiritual systems that had given those cities meaning had begun to lose their hold on the collective imagination. There is something deeply human in this pattern. It suggests that civilizations do not collapse simply because of external pressure or resource scarcity. They collapse when the meaning that people have invested in them begins to erode, when the system that had explained the world and organized daily life begins to fail repeatedly. People cease to believe in it. And once belief has fractured, even a physically capable population will abandon the structures that embodied that belief. The temples were built not merely as shelters, but as representations of cosmic order. The cities were organized not simply as administrative centers, but as models of the sacred world. When the rains failed and the order broke down, when the priests and the kings could not explain the disruption through the calendrical system that had always provided answers, the very purpose of these magnificent structures was called into question. How could a pyramid represent cosmic order when the cosmos seemed to be descending into chaos? And so the great cities were left to the returning forest. The vines crept across the stone. The jungle took back what human hands had briefly imposed upon it. The knowledge that had been written in stone and in codices survived, but much of it was lost. The tradition of writing began to decline. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge was preserved in oral traditions, carried forward by those who retained memory of the old ways. But the integrated system, the written word, the ceremonial center, the calendar-bound hierarchy, that system was dissolving. And yet what is most haunting about this slow forgetting is not the absence itself, but the evidence that people knew. Something was changing. In the ruins of Copan, archaeologists have uncovered what appears to be a deliberate filling in of doorways and passages in the royal palaces during the 9th century. Not collapse born of chaos, but something more measured, more intentional. As if the Maya were slowly sealing away their own monuments, as one might gently close the doors of a house being abandoned, room by room, chapter by chapter. The question we might ask ourselves in this deepening darkness is a quiet one. What does it feel like to watch your civilization transform? To experience not a single catastrophic moment, but rather a gradual dimming of the lights across generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many cities, the intervals between major construction projects grew longer and longer. A temple that once took 5 years to complete might have taken 15 in a later era. The pace of life itself seemed to be decelerating, as though the great engine of Maya civilization was running on reserve fuel, its cylinders firing more slowly with each passing decade. And in that slowing, something essential was lost, not immediately, but inevitably. The withdrawal of Maya elites from public life appears to have been one of the profound shifts. Where once kings had stood as visible conduits between the human and divine realms, commissioning monuments to mark every Khotun cycle and celebrating their bloodline through elaborate ceremonies, there emerged a strange silence. The inscriptions on stelae, those elaborate carved records of royal deeds and cosmic alignments, became less frequent. The ritual cycles that had ordered Maya time itself began to skip their beats. It was as though the social contract between ruler and ruled was quietly being renegotiated, or perhaps simply dissolving. One might imagine what such a transformation would have felt like to an ordinary Maya person living through it. Perhaps you were a stoneworker whose family had worked on the Great Pyramids for generations. One season, the new commissions simply did not arrive. Not with proclamation or ceremony, but simply did not arrive. What then? Did you turn your hands to other work? Did your children learn different skills? Did the pride of craft gradually give way to subsistence, to the small struggles of survival rather than the grand ambitions of empire? The evidence from settlement patterns during this period reveals something equally poignant. The population did not vanish, nor did it collapse into lawlessness, at least not everywhere. Rather, people moved. The great ceremonial centers were abandoned, yes, but the countryside was not. In fact, many rural areas show evidence of continued habitation, even growth in some cases. It was as though the Maya people were stepping back from the stage of monumental civilization, returning to a more sustainable, less demanding relationship with their land. There is speculation among scholars, and we must note that this remains speculation, built from the fragments we can read, that the environmental pressures that had been building for centuries finally became impossible to ignore or overcome. The carrying capacity of the land, stretched thin by centuries of agricultural intensification, had perhaps been exceeded. The forests that had been cleared to make room for growing populations and to feed the voracious appetite of stone and wood construction were not returning, and without those forests, the water cycle itself was disrupted. Cenotes dried more readily. Swamps became unstable. The seasonal rains, which had always been the lifeblood of Maya agriculture, became less predictable. It is a sobering thought that a civilization which had mastered mathematics, astronomy, writing, and architecture, which had built pyramids that still stand after 1,000 years, which had organized itself into complex city-states and maintained trade networks across hundreds of kilometers, that such a civilization might ultimately have been undone, not by invasion, not by plague, not by a sudden volcanic catastrophe, but by the simple reality of living beyond its means. By having asked too much of the land and the sky. The droughts that left traces in the geological record were not brief aberrations. Some lasted not months, but years. Imagine a rainy season that did not come, then imagine it happening again and again. What do you plant when you cannot trust the rains? How do you feed a population accustomed to abundance when scarcity has become the new normal? Some cities in the north, particularly in the Yucatan Peninsula, adapted more successfully to this new reality. They shifted their settlement patterns, becoming less dependent on the kind of large-scale agriculture that had sustained the southern lowlands. They moved toward coastal areas and cenote regions. They developed different political structures, less reliant on the divine kingship model that had dominated during the classic period. In a way, they survived by transforming themselves into something new. Not a collapse, perhaps, but an evolution born of necessity. Yet even in these northern regions, the great tradition of monumental building and elaborate inscriptions faded. The wheel of the long count, that extraordinary calendrical achievement by which the Maya had measured time itself back to creation, continued to turn, but fewer hands recorded it. Fewer voices sang the old prayers. The intellectual and artistic fluorescence that had defined the classic Maya civilization gradually dimmed. By the 10th century, the age that scholars call the Terminal Classic, the transformation was nearly complete. The great cities of the southern lowlands had been abandoned. The royal courts were silent. The ball courts no longer echoed with the sounds of ritual sport. And yet, and this is crucial to understanding what happened, the Maya did not disappear. Maya civilization did not end. It changed, profoundly and irrevocably, but it did not cease to exist. The people who had built these cities did not simply vanish into the forest, leaving behind only ruins. Rather, they adjusted, they adapted, they became, in many ways, different from what they had been before, just as all peoples do when great changes transform their world. The children born in the 10th and 11th centuries did not grow up knowing the glory of the classic cities. That world was already ancient history to them, a memory told in stories around fires, a half-remembered age of greatness. Their world was smaller, more localized, less ostentatious in its displays of power, and yet it was theirs, and it endured. The inscriptions left behind contain something almost unbearable to read now, across the centuries. They speak of drought cycles, of failed harvests, of prayers carved into stone that were never answered. And what troubles archaeologists most is the realization that the Maya were sophisticated enough to understand the patterns unfolding around them. They could calculate the movement of Venus with stunning precision. They could predict eclipses generations in advance. And yet, when the water stopped coming reliably, when the seasonal rains grew unpredictable, knowledge of the cosmos seemed to offer no protection against the slow strangulation of their own world. There is a particular kind of helplessness in watching a civilization that possesses tremendous intellectual capability become unable to solve the crisis at their threshold. Some researchers have suggested that the very expertise the Maya elite had developed, their mastery of astronomical cycles, their ability to predict celestial events with accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries, may have created a false confidence. If we can see tomorrow's stars, the logic might have gone, surely we can manage tomorrow's climate. But the weather does not obey the same mathematics as the heavens. It is chaotic, influenced by forces far beyond the ability of any human observer to predict or control. The period we call the Terminal Classic, that final chapter of the southern lowlands, stretched not across decades but across generations. What makes this timeline so significant is that it reveals something about the nature of collapse itself. It is not always sudden. It is not always a single catastrophic moment. Sometimes it arrives like the tide going out, and by the time the people realize the water is not returning, years have already passed. The great cities did not empty in a season. Kings did not disappear overnight. Instead, families made individual decisions. A merchant in Tikal chose to relocate his business north. A farming family in Karakol decided to seek opportunities elsewhere. A priest in Naranjo made the difficult calculation that the gods of his fathers could be honored in a smaller temple with fewer resources. These choices, multiplied across thousands of people, created an exodus that no single decree could have coordinated. And because these were autonomous decisions made by individuals and families responding to their own circumstances, there was no central moment of surrender, no formal end. There was simply a gradual thinning of the population, a slow dimming of the ceremonial lights that had burned for centuries. The last dated monument erected in the southern lowlands was carved in the year 909 of our common calendar. It was found at a city called Toninar, and it commemorated the reign of a ruler whose name we have partially recovered from the glyphs. Whether this was truly the final monument, or whether others were created but have simply vanished into the earth, we may never know with certainty. What we do know is that sometime after this point, the practice of erecting dated stones ceased. The calendar that had marked time with such precision for generations fell silent. Some scholars have proposed that the collapse was not uniform across the region. Certain cities may have held on longer than others. Smaller settlements, less dependent on the elaborate trade networks that had sustained the great ceremonial centers, may have survived in diminished form for decades beyond the fall of the major sites. There is evidence of continued occupation at some locations, even as the hierarchical structures that had organized society disintegrated. People did not simply vanish, rather they scattered, and the civilization as an organized political and cultural entity ceased to exist in any recognizable form. What happened to the knowledge itself is perhaps as poignant as what happened to the cities. The Maya had developed writing. They had created a sophisticated system of notation that allowed them to record history, mathematics, ritual, and practical information. And yet, after the collapse, much of this knowledge system fell into disuse. The great libraries, if we can call them that, were abandoned. The schools where scribes learned the complex glyphs were emptied. A tradition of literacy that represented centuries of accumulated learning was interrupted, though not entirely severed. Some knowledge persisted among scattered communities. Some was transmitted orally. But the centralized system of knowledge preservation that the classic Maya civilization had maintained was fractured. It would not be recovered completely until Spanish conquistadors arrived more than 600 years later, bringing with them both scholarly interest and the tools of cultural destruction. The few codices, those precious folded bark books that survived the centuries in libraries and temples, would face new dangers. Some were burned by zealous priests who saw them as pagan abominations. Others were preserved, sometimes by the very conquest that was dismantling the civilization that had created them. And later scholars would work with these fragments, and with the inscriptions on stelae and altars, trying to piece together a narrative of a world that had been lost. What is remarkable is not that the Maya civilization collapsed. Civilizations rise and fall as part of the natural rhythm of human history, but that it collapsed despite possessing the intellectual resources to understand its predicament. They had mathematics, they had astronomy, they had writing, they had agricultural knowledge accumulated over millennia, and yet the convergence of environmental stress, political fragmentation, and the rigidity of systems that had become too dependent on each other created a cascade of failures that could not be arrested. There is something almost cruel about the sophistication of their collapse, if one can use such a word. It was not the failure of primitive people struggling against nature they could not comprehend. It was the failure of an advanced civilization to adapt quickly enough when the world it had been built upon began to change. The very systems that had allowed the Maya to flourish in the jungle, their hydraulic engineering, their centralized authority structures, their elaborate trade networks, became vulnerabilities when the rains failed. A system perfectly optimized for a particular climate becomes fragile the moment the climate shifts. A hierarchy designed to move resources efficiently becomes brittle when those resources dry up. Consider this: the more specialized a civilization becomes, the more dependent it is on stability. A hunter-gatherer society can disperse when resources fail and find new hunting grounds. A complex civilization, with its cities, its specialized crafts, its monument building, its elaborate religious systems, all of which depend on surplus agricultural production flowing into urban centers, is far more vulnerable to disruption. The Maya had become so successful in organizing the landscape to produce abundance that they had made themselves dependent on conditions that could not be guaranteed indefinitely. The weight of those final glyphs pressed into stone, left by hands that must have known something was ending, even if they could not name it fully. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all, not what caused the collapse, but whether those who lived through it understood what was being lost. In the centuries that followed the abandonment of the great centers, the forest returned with a patience that eclipsed human ambition. Vines thickened over pyramids. Roots cracked through carefully laid plaster and mortar. The jungle, which the Maya had spent so many generations clearing and ordering, simply reclaimed what had always been hers. And in that reclamation, something extraordinary happened. The forest began to preserve what it was covering. The very moisture and humidity that made life in the Yucatan so arduous for the Maya also created conditions that protected their monuments from the worst ravages of time. Stones survived, structures remained, entombed in living green, waiting for centuries until modern archaeology would rediscover them with something approaching wonder. But the people themselves scattered. Some migrated northward, toward the Yucatan Peninsula, where new cities rose and maintained a fragile continuity with the classical past. Chichen Itza, Mayapan, Tulum. These names would echo through history, and the people who built them would remember themselves as Maya. Yet the great ceremonial centers of the south fell silent. The astronomical observations ceased. The ball courts hosted no more games. The scribes who had perfected their craft over centuries simply stopped writing. What becomes of a civilization when its memory keepers vanish? There is something profoundly disorienting in that question, something that speaks to a fear that lives beneath the surface of human consciousness. We imagine ourselves as continuous, as building steadily upon the foundations of those who came before us. Yet the Maya experience suggests something more fragile about cultural memory than we often acknowledge. Knowledge does not preserve itself. Skills must be passed to willing students. Stories must be retold. The moment that chain breaks, truly breaks, across a generation, the loss becomes almost irreversible. The Spanish arrived in the 16th century to find not the unified, powerful civilization that had once existed, but a collection of smaller polities, still Maya in language, tradition, and spiritual worldview, yet diminished in scale and territorial control. The conquistadors had no way of knowing what they were not seeing. They could not recognize the magnitude of what had already vanished. To them, the Maya were simply the people they encountered, not understanding that they were encountering the descendants of a fallen empire whose true extent and sophistication had already been nearly forgotten by the people themselves. This is perhaps the cruelest dimension of the Maya collapse. It was not immediate and dramatic, like the sudden destruction of Pompeii. It was, instead, a slow forgetting, a gradual dimming of lights that had burned for nearly 2,000 years. Children were born to parents who remembered the great ceremonies. Those children grew to adulthood, never quite witnessing what their parents had known. By the time a full generation had passed without the traditional knowledge, a critical threshold had been crossed. The information had begun to disappear not from lack of writing, the Maya still wrote, but from lack of the social structures, the priestly hierarchies, the ceremonial calendars that had given meaning and necessity to that knowledge. And yet, the Maya civilization did not truly collapse. This is perhaps the most important realization one can reach when contemplating this history. What collapsed was a particular form of political organization, a system of city-states built around centralized temple authority. What collapsed was a specific mode of economic production, an arrangement of labor and agricultural surplus that could no longer be sustained. But the people endured. The culture endured. Millions of Maya people exist today, speaking Mayan languages, maintaining certain traditional practices, understanding themselves as continuations of an ancient lineage. When you visit communities in Guatemala, Mexico, or Belize where Maya people live, you are not witnessing a dead civilization. You are witnessing a living one that has been transformed by conquest and colonization, certainly, but one that has also proven remarkably resilient in maintaining threads of connection to its deep past. The question this raises is subtle but essential. At what point does a civilization truly cease to exist? Is it when the great monuments fall silent? Is it when the political structures dissolve? Is it when the writing systems are no longer used? Or is it only when the people who consider themselves part of that civilization disappear entirely? The answer, perhaps, is that these questions reveal the inadequacy of the word collapse itself. It assumes a before and after, a clear rupture. But what actually occurred was a transformation so gradual, so complex, involving so many different regions and timescales, that calling it by any single name seems to diminish rather than clarify. The archaeological record continues to yield new information, new insights that refine our understanding with each passing year. In recent decades, advanced technologies like LiDAR, that is, light detection and ranging, which can penetrate the forest canopy and reveal structures beneath the vegetation, have fundamentally altered what we can see of the classical Maya landscape. Entire cities unknown to modern scholarship have been revealed. The scale of the population before the collapse has been significantly revised upward. What scholars thought they understood about the distribution and density of Maya settlements has been replaced with a more complex, more densely networked picture of a civilization at its height that was far more interconnected and sophisticated than previously imagined. This ongoing revelation might itself tell us something important about how we know what we know, and how easily what seems certain can be displaced by new evidence. The Maya that we understand today is not the Maya that a scholar in 1960 understood. It is not even the Maya that a scholar in 2000 understood. Each generation of researchers adds layers, corrects assumptions, revises interpretations, and this, too, mirrors something about the Maya experience itself: the continuous reworking of understanding, the willingness to see old truths differently when new information demands it, the recognition that knowledge is not fixed and eternal, but flows and changes, like the rivers that cut through the limestone bedrock of the Yucatan. As the night deepens around the ruins of these lost cities, as the forest sounds settle into their quiet rhythms, there is something almost peaceful about contemplating this history without the need for simple answers. The Maya did not disappear, they transformed. Their great cities did fall silent, yes, but in that silence there was not necessarily an ending, but rather a long, slow transition that would echo forward through centuries, leading eventually to the people and communities that exist today, carrying forward names and memories and spiritual practices that connect them still to those ancient astronomers and builders and merchants who once mapped the heavens and organized the world according to cycles of time that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. And so it comes to us now, across the span of more than 1,000 years, this peculiar silence that follows the last recorded dates carved into limestone and stucco. The hands that held the chisel did not lay it down in a single moment of catastrophe, as the earliest scholars imagined. Rather, there was a slow drawing away, a gradual release of the grip that had held these cities and their people in such intricate, luminous order. Consider what it means for a writing system to simply cease, not to be forbidden, not to be suppressed by some outside force, but to be quietly abandoned, as though the need for it had evaporated like dew from a cenote at dawn. The Maya did not lose the ability to write. Their hands remembered the forms. Yet the impulse to record, to mark time in those grand inscriptional cycles, began to fade during what scholars call the terminal classic period, those final centuries when the old order was untethering itself. What changes in a civilization when the very act of monument building loses its power? It suggests something deeper than political collapse, does it not? It suggests a transformation in how people understood their relationship to permanence itself. The great stelae and altars that had proclaimed the authority of kings and the order of time suddenly seemed to matter less. Or perhaps, and this is a possibility that modern archaeology has begun to entertain with increasing seriousness, the people who remained understood that their continuance lay not in stone, but in adaptation, in memory carried in voice and practice rather than in glyphic proclamation. The archaeological record shows us, with surprising clarity, that the major cities of the southern lowlands were not instantaneously emptied. There is evidence of what we might call a phased withdrawal. Some households lingered in the ruins of Tikal, even as the royal court's voice grew dim. At Palenque, the great aqueduct that had channeled water through the palace continued to flow after the dynasty's final king had ceased to rule. Someone still needed that water. Someone still lived there, tending gardens, drawing sustenance from the land that the ancestors had built upon. And yet the question that haunts each careful excavation, each dental analysis of remaining skeletal remains, each careful survey of abandoned agricultural terraces is this: if people remained, Why did the great machinery of civilization, the organized labor, the tributary system, the scribal schools, the astronomical observations performed by specialized priests, why did all of this simply come undone? The answer, it seems now, lay partly in the very success of that civilization. The Maya had flourished in a landscape of thin, fragile soils and seasonal water shortages. Their ingenuity was remarkable. Terraced fields, raised fields in swamplands, elaborate systems of reservoirs and channels. But these systems, when they worked, allowed for population density that was extraordinary for the region. Cities grew large, demand for resources grew with them, and when the climate faltered, when the rains became unreliable, when droughts stretched from seasons into years into decades, these dense populations suddenly required vast stores of corn, beans, and squash that the environment could no longer reliably provide. Some of the most compelling recent research suggests that the Maya lowlands experienced a series of severe droughts during the 8th and 9th centuries. We know this through the study of lake cores, through the analysis of stalactites and stalagmites that record subtle variations in rainfall through the thickness of their growth rings and the isotopic composition of their minerals. These are witnesses that cannot lie or exaggerate. They tell of dry periods that would have stressed a densely populated landscape to its limits. Picture, if you will, the experience of a maize farmer in the year 850. The rains that should have come in spring were meager. The stored grain from the previous year held, but barely. Tribute still had to be paid to the regional lord. Taxes in labor still had to be rendered to build temples to gods who, it might have seemed, were not listening. The social contract, which had always rested on the implicit promise that the king's ritual power would ensure agricultural sufficiency, began to strain. When the king could not deliver, when the ceremonial calendar aligned and the rains did not come, when prayers were offered and the sky remained cloudless, the authority that had bound the realm together began to fragment. And this, perhaps, was not experienced as a catastrophe, but as a slow disillusionment. A teacher of scribal arts might have noticed fewer young students presenting themselves. A stonemason might have found fewer commissions arriving from the palace. A priest maintaining the astronomical tables might have wondered, with a sadness that no record preserved, whether the stars themselves had forgotten the pattern. The breakdown was not simultaneous across the lowlands. Tikal, largest of the Maya cities, clung to a certain grandeur longer than its rivals. Yet even there, the monuments grew smaller, less frequent. The labor that once carved elaborate stelae with portraits of kings standing victorious over bound captives was redeployed to more mundane tasks, or released entirely. In some regions, the transformation was swifter. In others, the twilight of the old order extended across generations, each cohort knowing a little less of the old ways than the last. What happens to a priesthood when the very basis of its power, the claim to cosmic understanding and ritual efficacy, comes into question? Some of the Maya elite may have felt what we might recognize as a genuine loss of faith. Others may have sought new forms of legitimacy, turning their attention inward, becoming patrons of smaller, local communities, rather than maintaining the expensive machinery of intercity warfare and diplomatic grandeur. Still others simply moved. The population shifts visible in the archaeological record suggest that people migrated northward, toward the peninsula of Yucatan, where populations actually grew during the very centuries when the southern lowlands were being abandoned. This is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the Maya collapse. It was not, for many Maya, a collapse at all. It was a relocation, a reordering of priorities, a conscious choice to live differently. The post-classic Maya cities of the north, Mayapan, Chichen Itza, and others, would eventually flourish, developing new forms of political organization, new architectural styles, new ritual systems. They would preserve the Maya language, the Maya calendar, the core of Maya thought and practice. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they would encounter not a vanished people, but a transformed one, living according to principles that had evolved out of this very period of dissolution and reformation. The collapse, in other words, was only a collapse for those whose identity and power depended upon maintaining the old order. For the farmer, the artisan, the mother teaching her children the proper way to prepare corn, the shift may have been experienced not as apocalypse, but as return to a simpler life, to smaller communities, to the possibility of adequate harvest without the constant demand for tribute and labor. Yet loss there was, unquestionably. Knowledge dispersed. Libraries were not maintained. What records survive from this period are scattered, fragmented. The intricate astronomical knowledge that had been accumulated across centuries of careful observation could not be preserved intact when the institutions that held it dissolved. The great architectural traditions, the refinement of sculptural technique, the elaborate court ceremonies that had taken generations to perfect, all of these required an institutional continuity that the 9th and 10th centuries could not sustain. One might wonder, as one contemplates the silence that follows, whether some of the wise elders grieved for this, whether they recognized, with the particular clarity that loss grants us, what was vanishing as the cities emptied. And so it comes to us now, across the span of more than 1,000 years, this peculiar silence that follows the last recorded dates carved into limestone. The cities themselves did not vanish overnight, you see. They simply became quiet. The stones remained. The temples still stood, their stepped pyramids reaching toward the same sky. But the voices that once echoed through their plazas grew fewer, and then fewer still, until at last they ceased altogether. It is this gradual dimming, rather than a sudden extinction, that occupies the thoughts of those who study what was lost. Imagine, if you will, walking through a thriving city at dusk. The merchants are packing their wares, the scribes are setting down their brushes, the noble families prepare their evening meals in the great houses. Now imagine returning to that same place a generation later. Some buildings are abandoned, some have been reclaimed by the forest, some show signs of hasty departure, a jade piece left behind, a pot overturned, evidence of lives interrupted. This is perhaps closer to the truth of what happened across the Maya lands during those final centuries of the Classic period, from roughly the 8th through the 10th centuries of our modern calendar. One of the most puzzling aspects of this transformation is that it was not uniform. Some cities fell silent while others continued to hold populations for another 100 years or more. Calakmul, that great rival city to the south and east, experienced its final monument, dated to 909 in the Maya long count calendar. Tikal, though its grandest building age had long since passed, maintained some settlement until much later. Karakol, perched high in the Belizean highlands, retained a reduced population well into what would have been called the early post-classic period. The collapse, therefore, was less a single event and more a cascading series of transformations that rippled outward from different centers at different times, a wave that broke not all at once, but in a series of rolling swells across the landscape. Scholars have long puzzled over why the great cities of the southern lowlands were so particularly vulnerable to whatever pressures were mounting. Why did the sophisticated infrastructure of the northern cities of the Yucatan Peninsula prove more resilient? Why did some communities abandon their ancestral homes while others adapted, contracted, but endured? These are questions without simple answers, but they point towards something fundamental about how societies respond to stress. Not all stresses are created equal. Not all populations respond identically to the same pressures. And sometimes, the very strengths that made a civilization flourish in one era become liabilities in another. Consider the matter of the elite. The Maya civilization, particularly in its great classic period, had been organized around a sophisticated system of rulership. Kings were not merely political figures, but sacred intermediaries between the human realm and the divine. They were expected to perform rituals, to conduct wars, to maintain cosmic order through their very presence and actions. This is a profound and beautiful concept in many ways, but it is also a fragile one. What happens when the king cannot deliver? What happens when drought persists despite the rituals? What happens when warfare, instead of bringing glory and wealth, brings only loss and refugees? The evidence suggests that during this period of transformation, the authority of the kings began to erode. The monuments grew smaller. The dates carved into stelae became less frequent. The inscriptions themselves changed, recording not the eternal glory of the dynasty, but increasingly mundane matters. One cannot prove from stone alone what went through the minds of these rulers, but one can read in their diminishing ambitions a certain quiet resignation. The cosmic order that they had been appointed to maintain seemed to be slipping through their fingers, and fewer stones were raised to commemorate their reign. Violence, too, appears to have increased during these final centuries. Inscriptions record more warfare, more conquest, more dynastic conflict. The great cities of the classic Maya period had known combat, of course. Warfare was woven into their culture. But what distinguishes the final era is a certain desperation in the violence, less formalized, less ritualistic, more often directed against neighboring communities, in what appears to have been a scramble for remaining resources. It is as though the rules of engagement were breaking down along with the rest of the social order. There is also the question of environmental stress, which some scholars have emphasized increasingly in recent decades. The Maya lowlands are not an easy environment. They depend on seasonal rainfall. The water table, in many places, depends on cenotes, those deep sinkholes that provide access to underground reserves. What if the rainfall patterns changed? What if a series of droughts lasting not just years but decades began to strain the capacity of the system? We know from studying ancient lake cores and cave formations that the climate around 900 CE in Mesoamerica showed evidence of drying, of disruption to established patterns. Whether this was the primary cause of the collapse or merely one factor among many remains debated, but it is difficult to imagine how such a stress could have been anything other than profound. The forests themselves may have played a role in what happened. The Maya had transformed vast areas of the lowlands through agriculture, clearing land for maize cultivation, building terraces, creating reservoirs, managing water systems with remarkable sophistication. But this transformation created a landscape that was, in many ways, fragile. When populations were stable and well organized, these systems worked beautifully. When population pressure increased, or when the society began to lose cohesion, the environmental infrastructure could become a liability rather than an asset. Forests that had been cleared for agriculture could not suddenly be restored if the farmers departed. Soil that had been depleted could not quickly recover. A land carved up for one civilization might not sustain another. What emerges from these various strands of evidence, environmental, social, political, military, is a picture not of a sudden catastrophe, but of a slow unraveling. Imagine a rope under tension. A single strand snaps, and the rope holds. A second frays, and it still remains intact. But when multiple strands fail simultaneously, when the tension that had held the structure together begins to dissipate, the whole rope loses its integrity. This is perhaps what befell the great cities of the southern lowlands. Not a meteor from the sky, not an invasion by a foreign power, but a complex interplay of stresses that the system, for all its sophistication, could not ultimately absorb and survive. One might even reflect that sometimes the most advanced civilizations are the most fragile, built on assumptions that can only remain valid under particular conditions, and vulnerable when those conditions shift. And so it comes to us now, across the span of more than 1,000 years, this peculiar silence that follows the last recorded dates carved into limestone. What emerges from the archaeological record in the centuries following those final monuments is not a sudden vanishment, but rather a slow transformation, a society reorganizing itself around different values, different centers of power, different ways of measuring the passage of time itself. In the northern reaches of the Yucatan Peninsula, a different kind of Maya civilization began to flourish, precisely as the southern cities entered their gradual decline. The great centers of Chichen Itza and Mayapan rose to prominence, their architecture distinctly different from that of their predecessors. Where Tikal and Copan had built upward in pyramids of stone and stucco, these northern cities constructed low, sprawling structures. They embraced a different aesthetic, one that speaks to us of a people less concerned with reaching toward the heavens and more focused on the horizontal organization of space and power. One might wonder whether this architectural shift itself reflects a philosophical change, a turning inward, a reassessment of what mattered most in the organization of a city and a kingdom. The evidence suggests that the northern cities, while certainly influenced by their southern cousins, developed along their own trajectory. They adopted and adapted Maya knowledge, the calendar system, the writing, the agricultural wisdom, but they filtered these inheritances through their own lens. When the terminal classic collapse was occurring in the south, these northern settlements were actually growing. Their populations swelled. Their markets flourished, their temples filled with worshippers. Yet they too would eventually experience their own transformation, their own moment when the great ceremonial centers lost their magnetism and people dispersed once again into smaller, more locally organized communities. This pattern repeats itself so consistently throughout the Maya world that one begins to see it not as failure, but as rhythm, the rise and fall, the concentration and dispersal, the building up and the releasing. It mirrors, in some ways, the very calendar systems the Maya themselves had so carefully calculated. They understood cycles. They understood that time moved in great wheels, each turning through its appointed course before yielding to the next turning. Is it possible that their own civilization operated according to a similar principle? That what appears to us as collapse was, in their own understanding, simply the conclusion of one great cycle and the beginning of another? The evidence of continuity is striking when one looks for it in the right places. In the smaller towns and villages that dotted the landscape between and around the great ceremonial centers, life continued with a steadiness that the movement of empires did not disturb. Farmers tended their milpas, those ingenious gardens of corn, beans, and squash that sustained the civilization from its earliest days through its latest. Women still made pottery, passing down techniques perfected over centuries. Hunters still moved through the forests. Fishermen still cast their nets into the rivers and cenotes. The great machinery of state may have loosened its grip, but the machinery of daily life hummed along much as it always had. Archaeological evidence from settlement patterns shows something that early scholars of the Maya collapse often overlooked. While the great cities were depopulating, the countryside was not abandoned. Instead, it appears that people were leaving the urban centers and returning to a more dispersed, village-based existence. This was not a catastrophic flight from uninhabitable territory. This was a choice, made gradually and repeatedly across generations, to live differently. The labor that had once been marshaled into the construction of enormous pyramids and the maintenance of sprawling court systems was now directed toward household production, toward family lands, toward the strengthening of local community bonds rather than distant imperial ones. In some regions, this shift appears to have been remarkably peaceful. In others, there is evidence of conflict, burnt structures, displaced populations, the archaeological markers of violence and displacement. The story was not uniform. The Maya world was vast, and within it, many different stories were unfolding simultaneously. In some places, The transition happened quickly. In others, it stretched across centuries. Some centers recovered and rebuilt themselves several times before finally being abandoned. Others simply faded with remarkable quietness, their temples gradually overwhelmed by the forest that had always surrounded them, waiting to reclaim what humans had briefly borrowed from the green. One of the most intriguing aspects of this period is the matter of written language itself. The classic Maya script, that intricate system of glyphs and hieroglyphs that had been so central to the power of the great kings, began to disappear from public monuments. The last dated stone was erected in 910 of our calendar. After that point, the tradition of carving historical records into limestone simply ceased, at least in the southern lowlands. But did this mean that writing itself disappeared? Or did it perhaps transform into something different, something that was not preserved in stone, and therefore left no trace for us to find? The scribes who had served the kings must have gone somewhere. Their knowledge did not simply evaporate. Perhaps it was preserved in codices made of bark paper, in the memories of families who continued to practice the craft in private. Perhaps literacy became less of a public display and more of a private art, practiced in homes and small workshops rather than in the grand palaces of kings. The silence of the stones, then, may not represent the absence of knowledge or culture, but rather a shift in how that knowledge was valued and displayed. A reflection might settle upon us here. We understand the past through what it chooses to leave behind. And if a people deliberately chose to leave less behind, to invest their efforts in perishable materials rather than monumental ones, in local stories rather than inscribed histories, in the present moment rather than in the record for posterity, then we will inevitably find their world less visible to us. Their silence is not proof of their absence. It is proof only that we are looking in the wrong places or with the wrong expectations. What the archaeological record does preserve, if we listen closely enough, is the evidence of continued vitality in the post-classic period. The northern cities of the Yucatan did continue the tradition of carved monuments for some centuries longer than the south. At Chichen Itza, dated inscriptions continue into the 12th century, but eventually this practice too faded away. The long count calendar, that magnificent achievement of mathematical and astronomical brilliance, was gradually displaced by the 52-year calendar round as the primary tool for temporal reckoning. Did this represent a loss of knowledge, or a conscious choice to simplify, to return to a system better suited to the rhythm of agricultural life rather than to the grandiose calculations of distant empires? The answer remains elusive, preserved only in the space between the artifact and the interpretation. And so it comes to us now, across the span of more than 1,000 years, this peculiar silence that follows the last recorded dates carved into limestone. The cities stood empty. The great plazas fell quiet. The hands that once orchestrated the movements of tens of thousands simply ceased their work. And the jungle, that patient and infinitely persistent force, began its slow reclamation of what human ambition had claimed. We find ourselves, then, at the threshold of understanding, not the moment of collapse itself, which we have traced through drought and disease, through social fracture and the exhaustion of resources, but rather what that collapse means when we step back and consider it within the broader arc of human civilization. The Maya did not disappear, as popular imagination has long insisted. Rather, they transformed. Their cities emptied, yes, but their descendants endured. In the highlands of Guatemala, in the villages of Belize and the Yucatan, Maya people continue still, to speak their languages, to practice ceremonies that echo with the memory of their ancestors, to maintain a connection to the cosmos that the ancient astronomers themselves would recognize. The monumental civilization crumbled, but the culture persisted in quieter, more dispersed forms, adapting as all living things must adapt when the world around them shifts irreversibly. Perhaps this is the most profound lesson the Maya collapse offers us. if we approach it with sufficient patience and humility. It teaches us that the fall of great empires is rarely absolute, and that survival itself assumes many guises. The lowland classic Maya civilization, with its enormous cities and intricate bureaucracies, its monumental architecture and sophisticated calendrical systems, represented a particular expression of human possibility, one that flourished brilliantly for nearly 7 centuries before the conditions that sustained it gradually eroded. But the philosophy, the knowledge, the spiritual traditions that generated that civilization did not vanish with the last stela. They transformed, they dispersed, they found new containers and new contexts in which to persist. The collapse, viewed from this angle, becomes less a story of failure and more a story of adaptation and resilience. What appears to us across the centuries as loss was experienced by the Maya themselves and by their descendants as profound change. The great centers may have been abandoned, but the knowledge contained within them was not. The astronomical observations, the mathematical innovations, the agricultural practices refined over centuries, the spiritual cosmology that wove the visible world into connection with the unseen, all of these continued to circulate, to be refined, to be transmitted from one generation to the next through means we only partially understand even now. Consider what transpired in the northern Yucatan during the post-classic period, after the southern lowlands had quieted. In cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan, new centers of power rose, drawing upon the intellectual and artistic heritage of the fallen cities, yet synthesizing these traditions with influences from other cultures. The collapse of the South did not mean the cessation of Maya civilization. It meant the reconfiguration of it. And might we not recognize, in this pattern, something that resonates with our own contemporary moment? Civilizations do not so much end as they do metamorphose, and what feels like an ending to one generation may appear to the next as merely a chapter's close within a longer, more intricate narrative. The environmental pressures that contributed to the classic collapse, the droughts, the deforestation, the soil depletion, speak to us across the millennia with particular urgency. Here were a people who possessed remarkable knowledge, who could predict celestial cycles with precision that would astonish modern astronomers, who had developed complex systems of governance and resource management, and yet they could not, ultimately, sustain their civilization within the constraints of their environment. They pushed against ecological limits, and the system that depended upon maintaining delicate balances shattered under the strain. Is this not a whisper of warning to us, in our own age, when we too confront the consequences of exceeding the Earth's capacity to replenish what we consume? The Maya did not understand their ecological crisis in the terms we might use. They had no concept of carbon or feedback loops in the scientific sense. Yet they encountered the inexorable reality of living within a finite system, and they could not bend that reality to their will, no matter how sophisticated their calculations or how powerful their institutions. One might pause here and ask, what would the ancient Maya themselves say if they could see what we have made of their memory? What would they make of our attempts to reconstruct their world from broken monuments and partial records? Perhaps they would smile at our earnestness, at our effort to piece together meaning from fragments. They would understand, perhaps, that all civilizations eventually become fragmentary to those who come after, that the future inherits only ruins and enigmas, interpretations and questions. The collapse of classic Maya civilization remains, in many respects, a mystery. We have grown more sophisticated in reading the signs, the isotopic signatures of droughts in ice cores and cave formations, the archaeological evidence of social stress and abandonment, the astronomical data that explains the calendrical obsessions of the Maya elite, and yet the precise mechanisms that transformed a thriving civilization into a system of abandoned cities elude our complete understanding. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps mysteries serve a necessary function, preventing us from sliding into the false comfort of absolute certainty. The Maya civilization fell, and fell for reasons we can partially reconstruct and partially intuit. But the exact algebra of cause and effect, the precise moment when reversible decline became irreversible collapse, remains tantalizingly beyond our grasp. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the fall was not sudden in human terms, though it may have felt sudden to those who lived through it. Decades, perhaps a century or more, elapsed as the great cities gradually drained of population, as the political structures that held the civilization together fragmented and dissolved. It would have been possible, at certain moments in this process, for different choices to have been made, for resources to have been more carefully managed, for population growth to have been more constrained, for the hierarchical systems that concentrated power in the hands of elite networks to have been reformed or restructured. But these choices were not made, or if they were attempted, they came too late or proved insufficient to arrest the underlying dynamics that were pulling the civilization apart. And here, perhaps, is where the story of the Maya achieves its deepest resonance. It is not so much about them as it is about us, about the universal patterns that govern the rise and fall of complex societies, about the ways in which success can breed the seeds of future failure, about the difficulty of maintaining balance over centuries when the pressures to exploit resources and aggrandize power are so great. The Maya were not uniquely foolish or uniquely doomed. They were human beings operating within the constraints and possibilities of their time, making rational choices according to their understanding and their needs. And those choices, in aggregate, produced consequences that eventually exceeded the system's capacity to absorb them. The jungle grew back over the temples, the great plazas filled with soil and sprouting vegetation. Stelae toppled and split, inscriptions weathered until they could no longer be read. For centuries, the cities stood silent, their grandeur fading into rumor and legend, until eventually they were rediscovered. First by the Spanish conquistadors, who took little note of the ruins, and then by the scholars and adventurers of later centuries, who began the slow work of piecing together the civilization from the fragments that remained. And now, in our modern age, we have come to understand more deeply what had been lost, what had persisted, and what the Maya collapse might teach us about ourselves. The silence that followed their city's abandonment has gradually been broken, not by any resurrection of the ancient civilization, but by the voices of scholars, archaeologists, linguists, and the descendants of the Maya themselves, who have worked to recover and reclaim their heritage. In this recovery lies a kind of resurrection that is perhaps more meaningful than any literal restoration could be. The knowledge is transmitted anew, the astronomical calculations are recalculated and verified, the calendrical systems are understood with greater depth, and the spiritual traditions of the Maya continue to evolve and adapt, much as they have for centuries, maintaining a thread of continuity that stretches back through the collapse, back through the classic period, back into the mists of prehistory. The night falls gently around these reflections. The stars that once watched over the Maya cities still wheel through their appointed courses, still follow the mathematical patterns that ancient astronomers spent their lives mapping. And somewhere in the Yucatan, in the highlands of Guatemala, in villages whose names are not known to the wider world, people still speak the Maya languages, still observe ceremonies rooted in traditions older than the great cities themselves. The civilization fell, the people endured, and in that paradox lies perhaps the truest understanding we might reach of what the Maya collapse truly means. A reminder that what we call the end is often merely a transformation, and that the deepest currents of human culture flow with a persistence that no catastrophe can entirely interrupt.